Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I'll be providing another ranking video. This ranking video is going to be of the genre publishers. I don't know how to say that better. Yeah, my rankings of the genre publishers. I have not read from every major genre publisher, and I have some of them I've only read a little bit of, so they don't make my list here, but when I read more from them, I will be able to include them more. So first, let me get out first of all, I want to say I love reading from any genre publisher. Any genre publisher can make an amazing book, but there are some that I prefer reading from because they have a good track record. I like their style of cover art. I like the style of editing. I like the style of story that this publisher tends to produce. So why don't we get into that? So I have 4 honorable mentions, and then I'll go through those really quickly, and then I have my top 5 on my list. Honorable mentions. Number 4 is ROC, and number 3 is Ace. The reason that these two are so low is because I just have not read a lot from them. I believe I've read some of the, I think some of the Dune books that I own are published by them, and I think some of the Jim Butcher Dresden File books that I have are published by them, but I just haven't read that much from them. And I've liked what I've read, and I've liked some of the covers, but just haven't read that much, so that's why they're on here. Number 2, Harper Voyager. Harper Voyager makes some great fantasy, but they don't make epic fantasy, at least not from what I've been able to find. The Harper Voyager fantasy books that I found have been more of the kind of unique twist. The Chuck Wendig sci-fi books that I've read, as well as the Poppy War books by R.F. Kuang. Those types of books have been published by Harper Voyager, and that's why they're not as high on my list. And my last honorable mention is probably the one that will shock most people, that it's not in the top 5 and rather in an honorable mention, and that is Orbit. I've actually read quite a few Orbit books. The reprints of the Saga of the Seven Sons was Orbit. I've read some of the what's that series called? The Malice, The Faithful and the Fallen, Malice. Some of those books were Orbit. I have some other Orbit books on my list. So I have a lot of Orbit books that I've read, but their cover art is never what I would hope a cover art to be. And when they do like trade paperbacks, they do those incredibly huge floppy trade paperbacks, and they rarely do mass markets. And when they do mass markets, I don't love the covers as much. So they're just not in design a favorite, and they haven't necessarily made my absolute favorite series. That being said, if I come across an Orbit book and I love it, that's wonderful, and it'll bump it up on the list. But for right now, it's on my honorable mentions. So let's get to my top 5. My top 5. These are ones that I've read a lot from these publishers. I've really liked what I've read, and I love their cover arts and everything. So my number 5 is going to be Pocket Books from Simon & Schuster. Now, Pocket Books doesn't do too much, or I should say hasn't, because it's really defunct now. It's essentially been taken over by Gallery. But Pocket Books was the premier publisher for the Star Trek books from the early 80s all the way through the mid 2010s. Actually, really the late 2010s. So for 30 plus years, they produced hundreds upon hundreds of Star Trek novels, and they had a consistency rate of just publishing Star Trek novels, and they started out really small, and they got larger and larger, and then they had this epic post-Nemesis series that they made, and they really treated tie-in fiction well. Other than, like, Star Wars was always treated the best of the tie-in fictions, and most of the other tie-in fictions were here, and Star Trek was kind of in the middle. Like, they were treated really well, but they never got up to the level of Star Wars is treated well, but they were so consistent in just turning out product, doing 1 book a month for a while, then doing 2 books, then going back down to 1 book a month, but consistently turning in quality books that I appreciated. Their cover arts range from some horrible ones to some amazing ones that I've really enjoyed, I know that there are some pocket books of non-Star Trek books in the genres like sci-fi and fantasy, but I haven't read that too much. It's mostly just been Star Trek that I've read from Pocket Books. My number 4 is going to be Bantam Publishing. Bantam, to me, is most known for 2 things. They published the Star Wars books in the 1990s, which I think they did a fairly good job considering they didn't really know how to. They were kind of thrust into it when their editors said, I'm going to do it, darn it, I'm going to do it and do it well in hardcover, which doing a tie-in book in hardcover is always a big risk. Like you better know it's going to sell. And it worked out, thankfully. But they also published George R.R. Martin's, series that he's done, like the A Song of Ice and Fire. They also produced some other books, like the Hyperion books that I've really enjoyed, and a couple of other epic fantasy series that I've liked. So Bantam, and they actually have some really cool cover art. Even when they switch to modern cover art, I actually typically quite enjoy Bantam's cover art. They do good mass market stuff really well, and they typically have good consistency of if they're going to redo cover art, they redo it for the whole series, and it works out really well. So that's why Bantam is my number 4. Getting to my number 3 is Bane books. Bane is a lot smaller in their scope, and they typically focus, or at least have focused, on exclusively mass market books in the past. But they have just this style of sci-fi that just sticks out. I'm thinking of the David Weber books, the Timothy Zahn books, the Thomas Pope books, all these books that are just, classic sci-fi novels. They do them really well. They feel like classic sci-fi books. And they have this, again, I talk about consistency in the cover art, consistency of the design. Whenever I pick up a Bane book, if I haven't looked at who the publisher is, the second I look at the cover, I know it's a Bane book because they use the same type of font. They have this kind of military look to the books that I really enjoy, this kind of the darker background with the bright coloring on the letters. It really works well, I think. So that's why Bane is my number 3. My number 2 is going to be Del Rey. Del Rey has, ever since about 1999, through modern day, has published the Star Wars books, although they're going to another imprint soon. They're going to the Random House Worlds. And then they've also done a lot of fantasy sci-fi. Their most known fantasy series is probably Terry Brooks's Shannara series, but they also did the Red Rising series. They did Naomi Novik's novels. They did a bunch of other books that I have. And Del Rey, their cover arts aren't always so interesting, but they have this dedication to the fantasy genre, and not just to fantasy, but to expanding what fantasy is, that is really laudable. Sometimes I just want a classic fantasy book. That's why I have so many Shannara novels, because I just knew it was a good classic fantasy. But sometimes I want to try something new, and you can always have it at Del Rey. And there's such a wide type of authorship there that you'll find something that you'll like with Del Rey. And they, back in the day, they had some epic covers, and now their covers aren't so great. But back in the day, they had epic covers. But my number 1, probably surprising no one, is Tor Publishing. Tor has been, ever since I started The Wheel of Time, has been my favorite publisher because they have such great fantasy cover arts, because they used people like Daryl K. Sweet and Michael Whalen, 2 of the best cover artists in the business, and they had this, especially in the 90s, they had this sense of, we are epic fantasy. This is the style of epic fantasy, and we own it. I don't think anyone, not even Del Rey, not Orbit, not Harper Voyager, nobody took the epic fantasy feeling from Tor. Tor just owned it. And I think that's a lot to do with Tom Doherty and the way he's run Tor over the last 30 years. But I think it's also due to the fact that they had such great authors and great cover artists that work for them. They got the feeling, they got the tone, they got the types of stories, the type of epic fantasy, that kind of medieval epic fantasy, specifically that 90s era. They owned it. They did really well with it. And much like Bane, like sometimes you don't know a book's a Del Rey book until you pick it up. But much like Bane, when I see a Tor book, generally, I pretty much know it's a Tor book. And I've read some Tor books I haven't liked, certainly, and that's not necessarily the fault of the publisher, but the fact they made so many big series that I've been able to get into and love, that's why I put them so high on the list. So that is my ranking of my top 5 genre publishers. So if you have like a ranking, which ones are your favorites, which ones are your least favorites, let me know in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.